Some love stories begin with flowers, sweet messages, and chance encounters. This one begins with a millionaire bank, a frighteningly controlling father, and a powerful man making a decision so absurd that any sensible person would call it madness. And maybe it was, but somehow it worked. The conference room on the 32nd floor smelled like leather and cold coffee. Matthew Turner stood behind the glass wall of the executive corridor, his tie loosened just enough to suggest the day had already been long. He was reviewing a merger proposal on his tablet when movement caught his eye. Two people walked toward the branch manager's office. A man in his late 50s, silver-haired, back straight as a flagpole, and beside him, a young woman. She was small. That was the first thing Matthew noticed, small enough that the hallway seemed to swallow her. Her hair fell past her shoulders in soft blonde waves, and when she glanced sideways at the receptionist who greeted them, he caught a glimpse of dimples pressing into her cheeks, a shy smile that lasted half a second before it disappeared. The man's hand gripped her arm just above the elbow, not guiding, holding. Matthew watched them enter the office. He set his tablet on the nearest desk and didn't pick it up again. 20 minutes passed. He moved to the corridor near the manager's door, pretending to check something on his phone. When the door opened, he was ready. "Good afternoon." He extended his hand to the older man first. "Matthew Turner, I'm the president of this institution." The man's eyebrows lifted. He shook Matthew's hand with the calculated firmness of someone used to measuring others. "Richard Caldwell." Matthew turned to the young woman. Up close, her eyes were a shade of green that reminded him of shallow water in the sun. There were faint shadows beneath them, the kind that come from too many quiet nights. "I understand you're here regarding an inheritance matter," he said gently. "I'm sorry for your loss. Is there anything we can do to make this process easier for you?" She opened her mouth. "Everything is being handled," Richard said. His voice cut through the air like a closing door. "We appreciate the courtesy." The young woman pressed her lips together, but her eyes stayed on Matthew's. 3 seconds, maybe 4. Long enough for something to shift inside his chest, something that felt like a lock turning in a room he didn't know existed. If this story is touching your heart, show your support. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it with your friends. Every action helps us keep bringing you new stories full of emotion. Then Richard steered her toward the elevator, and she was gone. Matthew stood in the corridor for a full minute after the elevator doors closed. His pulse was doing something unfamiliar. He pressed 2 fingers to his wrist and counted 89 beats per minute. He hadn't been above 70 during a negotiation in years. He went back to his office and shut the door, sat behind his desk, opened his laptop. Nothing made sense for the rest of the afternoon. That night, he searched for her. Sienna Caldwell. The name appeared in the inheritance filing his team had processed. He typed it into every platform he could think of. No social media, no professional profiles, no photos, no mentions, no digital trace of any kind. It was as if she existed only in the physical world, visible to those allowed close enough to see her. By the 3rd sleepless night, he made the call. David Hargrove was a private investigator Matthew had used twice before for corporate due diligence. He was thorough, discreet, and expensive. Matthew gave him the name and waited. The dossier arrived on a Thursday evening. Matthew read it at his kitchen counter with a glass of whiskey he never drank. The ice melted. The pages kept turning. Sienna Caldwell, 25 years old. Mother deceased 18 months ago. Raised inside a gated estate in Connecticut. No school records beyond a homeschool certification. No employment history. No driver's license. She had never attended a single institution outside those walls. Her father, Richard Caldwell, had built a mid-size fortune in international commodities, but his ambitions ran larger than his bank account. The report detailed a business alliance with a foreign businessman, a man named Amir Farouk, whose reputation preceded him in the worst possible way. Farouk and his son were known in certain circles for cruelty wrapped in wealth, the kind of men who collected things, art, horses, people. The arrangement was simple and sickening. Richard Caldwell would give his daughter in marriage to Farouk's son. In exchange, the two families would merge business operations worth tens of millions. Sienna was the price. Matthew set the papers down. His hands were steady, but his jaw ached from clenching. He looked at the single photograph clipped to the front page, a grainy image pulled from a property security feed. She was standing near a garden wall, face tilted toward the sky, completely alone. He poured the whiskey down the sink. Something had cracked open inside him the moment her eyes met his in that corridor. He couldn't name it yet, couldn't shape it into something logical, but it sat in his ribs like a stone, heavy and permanent. He picked up his phone, not to call anyone, just to stare at the screen while his mind raced through 100 impossible plans. Somewhere in Connecticut, behind walls he couldn't see, she was locked inside a life she never chose, and he had no idea what to do about it. "You look terrible." Claire Turner dropped onto the leather couch in her brother's office without waiting for an invitation. She crossed her ankles on the coffee table and studied him with the kind of attention that made most people uncomfortable. Matthew didn't look up from his screen. "I'm fine. You've worn the same watch 3 days in a row. You never repeat accessories during the work week. Something's wrong." He almost smiled. Almost. His sister had the observational skills of a detective and the subtlety of a fire alarm. At 29, Claire ran the bank's communications department with the same chaotic energy she brought to everything else, loud, fast, and somehow effective. "It's nothing." "It's a woman." He looked up. She grinned. Knew it. He closed his laptop. There was no point lying to Claire. She'd find out eventually, and the interrogation would only get worse. So he told her. Not everything. Not the part about his chest feeling like it was full of wet cement every time he thought about Sienna's eyes. But enough. The visit to the bank, the father's grip on her arm, the dossier, the confinement, the arranged marriage. Claire's grin disappeared. She sat up straight, her feet dropping to the floor. "That's not a marriage," she said. "That's a transaction." "I know. And you've been losing sleep over this girl you met for 45 seconds in a hallway." "I'm not losing sleep." She tilted her head. "Matt, you have circles under your eyes dark enough to file taxes in." He rubbed his face with both hands. 9 days. It had been 9 days since the corridor, and every night was the same. He'd lie in bed replaying the moment her gaze found his, the way her lips parted as if she wanted to say something but had forgotten how. He'd think about the photograph from the security feed, her face turned toward the sky like someone praying for wind. He had considered a dozen approaches, a legal intervention, a direct confrontation with her father, a formal visit to the estate under some banking pretext. None of them worked. Richard Caldwell was careful, paranoid. The estate was private property, and Sienna was technically an adult making no public cry for help. There was no legal doorway in. "I need to see her again," he said quietly, "but I can't get in." Claire was quiet for a moment. Then something flickered behind her eyes. The same look she got before suggesting they sneak into their father's office as kids, or before convincing an entire gala to do the electric slide. "What if you were already inside?" "What do you mean?" "The estate has staff, groundskeepers, housekeepers, cooks. People come and go." She leaned forward. "What if you got in as one of them?" "Claire, hear me out. You need access, not a meeting, not a phone call. You need to be inside those walls, so become someone they'd let in." "I run a bank, and right now that's useless." She stood up and paced. "Find out who works the grounds, make friends, offer to fill in. You're tall and strong and you've never been afraid of getting your hands dirty. Literally, in this case." It was absurd. The kind of plan that only made sense if you squinted at it sideways. But Matthew had spent 9 days running out of rational options, and the irrational ones were all he had left. It took him 4 days. The estate's groundskeeper was a man named Douglas, 63 years old, with a bad knee and a love for horse racing. Matthew found him at a diner near the Caldwell property, introduced himself under a different name, and bought him lunch 3 days in a row. By the 4th day they were talking like old friends. When Matthew mentioned he was looking for outdoor work, Douglas laughed and said the Caldwell estate was the loneliest job in the state. Nobody stayed long. The pay was fair, but the atmosphere was heavy. On the 5th day, Douglas called in sick. He recommended his new friend as a temporary replacement. Matthew arrived at 5:30 in the morning. He parked a borrowed truck at the service entrance and walked through the iron gate carrying pruning shears he'd watched a YouTube video about the night before. The estate was enormous. Stone walls, manicured hedges, gravel pathways that crunched beneath his boots. The main house rose 3 stories high with curtains drawn on every window. It felt less like a home and more like a display case. He worked for 2 hours, pulled weeds, trimmed a row of boxwoods with the confidence of a man defusing a bomb. His shoulders burned in a way they hadn't since college crew, but his eyes kept drifting to the back door of the house. At 8:40, it opened. She stepped out in bare feet, a small plate balanced in one hand. Her hair was pulled back loosely, a few strands catching the sunlight. She walked past the stone patio, past the herb garden, and toward a bench half hidden behind a wall of tall hydrangeas and climbing jasmine. She sat down, took a bite of something that looked like pie, closed her eyes and tilted her face toward the morning sun. Matthew stood completely still, his hands frozen around a pair of garden shears. The smell of jasmine drifted toward him on the breeze, thick and sweet, mixing with the damp earth beneath his knees. Then she opened her eyes and saw him. The plate slipped in her hands. She caught it barely, but her face went pale. Her mouth opened slowly, her eyes wide with recognition. How did you... I needed to see you, he said. His voice was low, honest, stripped of every negotiation tactic he'd ever learned. She stood up so fast the plate nearly fell again. Her hands were shaking. You can't be here. You don't understand. If anyone sees, if my father finds out... I know about your father. That stopped her. She stared at him, her chest rising and falling too quickly, her fingers gripping the edge of the bench. You need to leave, she whispered. Right now. Please. She turned and walked back to the house without looking behind her. The screen door closed with a soft click that sounded to Matthew like a challenge. He picked up the shears and went back to the boxwoods. He wasn't going anywhere. The morning air tasted like rain that hadn't fallen yet. Heavy, electric, the kind that makes dogs pace and old men check their knees. Matthew was already kneeling by the rose beds when the back door opened at 8:35. 5 minutes earlier than the day before. He noticed everything now. Sienna walked to the bench with the same careful steps, the same small plate. This time it looked like a slice of cake with cream on top. She sat down, smoothed the fabric of her cotton dress over her knees and stared directly at him. He waited. You're still here, she said. Not a question, almost an accusation. I am. I told you to leave. You did. She broke off a piece of cake with her fingers and ate it without looking away from him. There was something different in her posture this morning. Yesterday, she had been a bird with its wings pressed tight against its body. Today, the wings were still folded, but her head was turned toward him. You're either very brave or very stupid, she said. My sister would say both. The corner of her mouth twitched, just barely. Then she looked down at her plate and pressed her thumb into a crumb. He set down the trowel and wiped his hands on his jeans. Stood slowly, the way you'd stand near a deer you didn't want to startle. He walked 3 steps closer and stopped. Still a safe distance, still enough room for her to breathe. I haven't stopped thinking about you since that day at the bank, he said. I tried. It didn't work. And when I found out what your life looks like behind these walls, I couldn't just sit in my office and pretend I didn't know. She was quiet for a long time. A robin landed on the hydrangea bush to her left and began singing with the kind of commitment only small birds have. What exactly do you think you know? Her voice was soft, but there was an edge underneath it. Not anger, something closer to exhaustion. I know you've never been to school. I know you've never had a job or a friend outside this property. I know your father keeps you here because it serves his plans, not because it protects you. Her jaw tightened. And I know about the arrangement, with the Farouk family. She flinched. It was small, a contraction of her shoulders, a quick blink. But he saw it. He saw all of it. You had no right to look into my life. You're right. I didn't. Then why did you? He held her gaze. The answer sat on his tongue like a word in a language he was still learning. Because when you looked at me in that corridor, I felt something I've never felt before, and I've spent every day since then trying to understand it. She set the plate on the bench beside her. Her hands went to her lap, fingers laced together, knuckles pressing white against each other. You felt something, she repeated. Yes. For me. Yes. You don't even know me. I know. That's why I'm here. The robin flew away. In the distance, a lawnmower started on the neighboring property, a low hum that vibrated through the ground. Sienna looked toward the house. The windows stared back, blank and watchful. Then she turned to him again, and for the first time, he saw something behind the caution in her eyes, a flicker of warmth, quick and fragile, like a match struck in the wind. If my father finds out you're here, really here, he'll destroy you. He can try. You don't understand what he's capable of. I understand more than you think. She stood. The plate stayed on the bench. She took one step toward the house, then stopped. Her back was to him, and he watched her shoulders rise and fall with a breath that seemed to carry the weight of years. Tomorrow, she said, without turning around. I'll be here at the same time. She walked inside and closed the door behind her. Matthew exhaled. His hands were trembling. He looked down at them, these hands that had signed contracts worth more than most people would earn in 10 lifetimes, and they were shaking because a woman with green eyes and bare feet had said the word tomorrow. He went back to the rose beds, pulled weeds he'd already pulled, cut stems that didn't need cutting. But his mind was somewhere else entirely, replaying the way her voice had softened on that last word. Tomorrow. That evening in his penthouse apartment, he stood under the shower with water so hot it reddened his skin. The muscles in his back ached from a full day of physical labor. His palms had blisters that stung when the water hit them. He pressed his forehead against the tile and closed his eyes. He could still smell the jasmine from the garden. She had clung to his clothes, to the collar of his shirt, to the inside of his memory where her face lived now. The way she'd eaten that cake with her fingers, the way she'd looked at the house like it was a cage she'd memorized every bar of. His phone buzzed on the bathroom counter. Claire. How'd it go? She told me to leave. And? She told me to come back tomorrow. A pause. Then Claire laughed, bright and sharp like a bell struck once. That's my future sister-in-law. Claire? Too soon? Fine, but I'm not wrong. He hung up and stood by the window, still dripping, a towel around his waist. The city stretched below him, all glass and light and purpose. He'd built his career on certainty, on reading people, on predicting outcomes, on controlling the variables. Nothing about Sienna Caldwell was a variable he could control, and for the first time in his life, that didn't scare him. It pulled him forward. 3 crows sat on the garden wall like a jury deciding something important. Sienna watched them from the stone bench, her bare feet tucked beneath her, a bowl of strawberries balanced on her knee. She'd been waking up earlier each morning without understanding why. Her body knew before her mind did. He arrived at the hydrangeas at exactly 8:30. Same boots, same worn jeans. But today he carried a small paper bag, which he set on the ground beside the bench before sitting on the grass across from her. What's that? She asked. Chocolate croissants. From a bakery on Maple Street. She stared at the bag like it might contain something dangerous. Then she reached for it, opened it, and the smell of warm butter and cocoa hit her before she even saw what was inside. She took a bite and closed her eyes. This is the best thing I've ever tasted. He watched her, the way the chocolate left a faint mark at the corner of her lips, the way her eyelashes pressed against her cheeks when she closed her eyes. He memorized it the way he memorized interest rates, automatically, permanently, without effort. You've never had a croissant? Not from a bakery, not fresh. She opened her eyes. I've never been to a bakery. The words landed between them like a stone dropped into still water. My mother used to bake, she continued, her voice quieter now. Lemon cake, mostly. The kitchen would smell like it for hours. After she died, the cook took over, but it was never the same. She paused. Nothing was the same. Matthew pulled a blade of grass from the ground and turned it between his fingers. He wanted to ask 100 questions. When did your mother die? What was her name? Do you have anything left of her? But he held them back. She'd give him what she wanted to give when she was ready. Tell me something about you, she said. Something real. He thought about it. Most people asked about his work, his portfolio, his plans for the bank's expansion. Nobody asked for something real. I can't cook anything, he said. Not even eggs. My sister tried to teach me once and I set off every smoke alarm in the building. Sienna laughed. It was the first time he'd heard it, full and sudden, catching her by surprise as much as him. The dimples appeared deep in her cheeks, and his chest did something he was going to have to stop pretending was normal. "How do you survive?" she asked. "Restaurants, delivery. Occasionally my mother takes pity on me and sends leftovers with my driver." "Your driver?" she repeated, and there was a flicker of something curious in her expression, like she was filing away a detail she didn't fully understand yet. He changed the subject, asked her what she did during the days. She told him about the library on the second floor of the mansion. Hundreds of books, most of them her mother's. She read 3 or 4 a week. Romance novels, travel guides, history books about places she'd never seen. She described the world the way someone describes a dream, vivid, longing, with the quiet understanding that waking up was inevitable. "I've read about the ocean in 11 different books," she said, "but I've never seen it." He looked at her for a long moment, then said nothing, because anything he could have said would have been too small for what he felt. The days folded into each other after that. Every morning she came to the bench. Every morning he was already there, waiting among the hydrangeas with dirt on his knees and something new in the paper bag. A blueberry muffin, a slice of apple pie, a cinnamon roll that left sugar on her fingers. She tasted each one like it was a discovery, and he watched each discovery like it was a privilege. They talked about everything and nothing. She told him about the constellations she could see from her bedroom window. He told her about the time Claire convinced him to jump off a dock fully clothed at their grandmother's lake house. She described the sound of rain on the mansion's glass roof like it was music. He described the sound of the trading floor on a Monday morning like it was war. They laughed more than he expected. She had a sense of humor that crept up slowly, dry, observational, delivered with those dimples and a tilt of her head that made him forget entire sentences. On the 4th day their hands touched. He was reaching for a fallen petal near her knee, and his fingers brushed hers. Neither of them moved. The contact lasted 2 seconds, maybe 3, but the warmth of her skin stayed on his knuckles for the rest of the afternoon. He replayed it while trimming hedges he'd already trimmed twice. On the 5th day, she asked him to walk with her. They followed a narrow path that wound behind the greenhouse, past a row of old oaks, and into a part of the garden where the hedges grew tall enough to block every window of the house. The air was cooler there, shaded, thick with the scent of wild mint and damp bark. She showed him a patch of wildflowers her mother had planted years ago, still blooming in stubborn defiance of everything else that had changed. "She loved this spot," Sienna said softly. "She said flowers don't care who's watching. They just grow." Matthew stood beside her, close enough to feel the warmth of her arm near his, close enough to notice the faint freckles scattered across the bridge of her nose, like someone had shaken cinnamon over her while she slept. He wanted to touch her face. Instead, he put his hands in his pockets and listened to the wind move through the oaks. On the 6th day, she leaned against his shoulder while they sat on the bench, just for a moment, just long enough for his breath to stop and restart in a different rhythm. She pulled away quickly, her cheeks flushed pink. "Sorry," she whispered. "Don't be." She looked at her hands. He looked at the hydrangeas. The silence between them was so full it could have been a conversation. That night he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, his phone dark on the nightstand, his mind impossibly bright. He thought about her shoulder against his, the weight of it, the trust in it. He was falling. He knew it now, and the ground was nowhere in sight. His hands knew the garden now, which roses needed cutting low, which hedges grew faster on the south side, where the soil stayed damp past noon and where it dried out by 10. A week of mornings had turned the bank president into something almost convincing, a man with calloused palms and grass stains on his knees who could tell the difference between jasmine and honeysuckle by smell alone. But none of it mattered as much as the 7 minutes it took her to walk from the back door to the stone bench each morning. Today, she was late. He checked his watch. 8:50, then 9, then 9:10. His chest tightened with each minute. He pruned the same rose bush 3 times, cutting so close to the stem that he'd probably killed it. At 9:15, the door opened. She walked out quickly, her steps uneven, her arms wrapped around herself. When she reached the bench, she didn't sit. She stood with her back to him, her shoulders drawn in tight. He set down the shears and walked to her, slowly, carefully. What happened? She didn't turn around. My father had guests for breakfast, business associates. He made me sit at the table and smile. One of them kept staring at me like I was something on a menu. Her voice was flat, controlled, but her fingers were gripping her own arms hard enough to leave marks. Matthew stopped 2 feet behind her. The urge to reach for her was so strong his hands ached with it. He's planning a dinner, she continued. Next month with the Farouk family. He told me to be ready. He said it like he was scheduling a delivery. She turned around. Her eyes were dry, but the green in them had gone dark, like a lake before a storm. I'm a package, Matthew, wrapped and addressed and waiting at the door. He took 1 step closer. No, you're not. You don't live in this house. And you won't live here forever. Something broke in her expression. Not tears. Something deeper. The kind of fracture that happens when someone says out loud what you've been telling yourself in silence for years, and it suddenly sounds possible. She sat down on the bench. He sat beside her, not touching, but close enough that she could feel the warmth of him if she leaned even slightly to the right. They stayed like that for a while. The garden hummed with bees and distant bird calls. The hydrangeas swayed in a breeze that carried the sweet smell of freshly cut grass. "Tell me something good," she whispered. He thought. Then he said, "Claire once tried to adopt a goat. She found it on a farm during a charity event and put it in the back seat of her car. My mother didn't speak to her for 3 days." Sienna exhaled something that was halfway between a laugh and a sigh. "What happened to the goat?" "It lives on my uncle's property in Vermont. Claire visits it every Thanksgiving. She named it, didn't she? Gerald." This time, Sienna laughed for real. The sound reached into the hollow space the morning had carved in her chest and filled it with something warm. She leaned to the right. Her shoulder touched his. He didn't move, didn't breathe. She stayed. They sat like that, shoulder to shoulder, while the sun climbed higher and the shadows shortened around them. She told him about a book she'd finished the night before, a story about a woman who sailed across the Atlantic alone. He listened to every word, but what he heard most was the longing underneath, the desire for a life that extended beyond stone walls and scheduled dinners. When she turned her face toward him, their noses were inches apart. He could see the tiny scar above her left eyebrow, could smell the faint sweetness of vanilla on her skin, like she'd been near something baking. She looked at his mouth, then back at his eyes. He reached up and touched her cheek with the back of his fingers, gently, like brushing dust off something precious. Her skin was warm and impossibly soft, and when she closed her eyes at the contact, his heart beat so hard he felt it in his throat. "Sienna." She opened her eyes. He leaned in, slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. His lips touched hers with a softness that surprised even him, light, careful, barely there. She tasted like strawberries, and something floral he couldn't name. Her breath caught, and he felt the small gasp against his mouth like an electric current. He kissed her the way you hold something fragile, with both hands and full attention. His lips moved over hers gently, guiding, teaching without pushing. He felt her fingers find the front of his shirt, gripping the fabric near his collarbone, pulling herself closer. Her mouth opened slightly against his, uncertain and brave at the same time, and he deepened the kiss just enough to let her feel what he'd been holding back for days. The world around them went quiet. The bees, the wind, the distant hum of the lawnmower, all of it disappeared into the space between their mouths. When he pulled back, her eyes were still closed. Her cheeks were flushed, her lips slightly parted, her fingers still twisted in his shirt. She looked like someone waking up from a dream they weren't ready to leave. "That was my first kiss," she said. Her voice was thin and shaking and full of wonder. He pressed his forehead against hers. "I know." "How?" "Because you held on to me like you were afraid I'd disappear." She opened her eyes. A tear slipped down her cheek, catching the sunlight before it reached her jaw. "I want to be with you," he said. "Not just here in stolen mornings behind the hedges. I want all of it. I want to take you to the bakery on Maple Street and watch you try every croissant they make. I want to show you the ocean." His voice was steady, but his hand trembled against her cheek. "I want you to be mine, Sienna, and I want to be yours." She pressed her lips together. The tears came faster now, and she wiped them with the heel of her hand. I can't. Tell me why. Because I'm not free. Her voice cracked on the word. There's a contract, signed by my father and the Farouk family. If I refuse the marriage, my father will... Your father doesn't control the rest of your life. He controls all of it. She pulled back. Her hands left his shirt and the absence of her grip felt like a wound. He controls what I eat, what I read, who I see. He chose the dress I'm wearing right now. She gestured at herself, a plain white cotton dress buttoned to the neck. You think I can just say yes to you and walk out the front door? Matthew held her gaze. His jaw was tight, his eyes burning with something that had moved past tenderness and into territory he hadn't visited before. Then we won't use the front door. She stared at him. He could see the war behind her eyes. Hope, fighting habit, desire wrestling with a lifetime of fear. You don't know what you're promising, she whispered. I know exactly what I'm promising. She didn't say yes, but she didn't say no. And when she walked back to the house, she looked over her shoulder once. That was enough. Sienna pressed her back against her bedroom door and listened to the house settle into silence. The floorboards creaked in their usual pattern. The grandfather clock downstairs struck 10. Mrs. Brennan's footsteps faded toward the staff quarters at the far end of the hall. She crossed the room and opened the window. The night air flooded in, cool, sharp, carrying the scent of the garden below. She leaned against the sill and looked down at the ivy climbing the east wall, the stone path that led to the fountain, the dark shapes of the hedges beyond. Nothing moved. She told herself she wasn't waiting, that she'd opened the window because the room was warm, because the air was thick, because her body needed something other than these four walls. But her heart was beating like it disagreed. A sound, soft, rhythmic, like someone climbing something they'd climbed before. Then hands appeared on the windowsill. Large hands, dirt still under the nails, gripping the stone with quiet confidence. And then his face lit by the faint glow of the hallway light under her door. Matthew pulled himself through the window and landed on the floor of her room with less grace than he probably intended. One knee hit the rug. He straightened, caught his breath and looked at her. She was sitting on the edge of the bed in a nightgown that reached her ankles, her hair loose around her shoulders. She was biting her bottom lip to keep from smiling. You climbed the wall, she said. I found footholds in the ivy. That ivy is older than my father. It held. And if it hadn't? Then I'd be in the rose bushes and you'd have to explain the noise. The smile broke through. She pressed her hand over her mouth to muffle a laugh that shook her whole body. He sat on the floor across from her, his back against the wall beneath the window, his legs stretched out in front of him. He didn't move toward the bed, didn't cross any line she hadn't drawn. I've been thinking all day, he said, about what you told me, the contract, your father, the Farouks. Her smile faded. She pulled her knees up to her chest and wrapped her arms around them. There has to be a way out, he continued. A contract like that, it's between two men trading a person. That's not legal, not enforceable, not in any court that matters. My father doesn't care about courts. He cares about power. So do I. She studied him. In the low light, his jaw looked sharper, his shoulders broader. But it was his eyes that held her. Dark, focused, burning with something she was only beginning to understand. What exactly are you planning? She asked. I don't know yet, but I will. That's not reassuring. It's honest. She rested her chin on her knees. You're risking everything, your reputation, your company. If my father finds out who you really are, then he'll know that the man who's coming for his daughter isn't some hired gardener. The room was quiet. Outside, a breeze rustled the ivy against the stone. Come here, she said softly. He looked at her. She unfolded her legs and shifted to make space beside her on the bed, not lying down, sitting, her back against the headboard, her hands folded in her lap. He stood, crossed the room and sat beside her. Their shoulders touched. The mattress dipped under his weight, tilting her slightly toward him. Tell me about your mother, she whispered. So he did. He told her about Margaret Turner, who had raised 2 children while their father built the bank, a woman who kept fresh flowers in every room and never answered the phone during dinner. He described the sound of her laughter, sudden and contagious like Claire's but softer, and the way she still called him every Sunday morning, no matter what. Sienna listened with her head tilted toward him, her temple almost resting on his shoulder. When he finished, she said, "She sounds like she loves well." "She does. My mother was like that. Quiet about it, but constant." Her voice thinned. "She tried to protect me. She fought with my father about the homeschooling, about the isolation, but he always won. And then she got sick and everything she'd been holding together just collapsed." He reached for her hand. She let him take it. Her fingers were cold, and he wrapped both of his hands around hers, warming them. "I miss her every day," Sienna said. "Some mornings I forget she's gone, and I start walking to her room before I remember." He didn't say he was sorry. He didn't say it would get easier. He just held her hand tighter and let the silence carry what words couldn't. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Time moved differently in that room, measured not by clocks, but by the slow rhythm of their breathing. She turned her face toward him. Close, so close he could feel the warmth of her breath on his chin. "Thank you," she whispered, "for climbing the ivy." He lifted their joined hands and pressed his lips to her knuckles. She watched him do it, her eyes following the movement with a kind of reverence. Then she leaned in and kissed him. It was different from the garden, braver. Her lips found his with purpose, pressing softly at first, then deeper. Her free hand came up to the side of his neck, her fingers sliding into the hair behind his ear. He inhaled sharply, the scent of her shampoo something like lavender and warm cotton, and his hand moved to her waist, steadying her, pulling her just close enough to feel her heartbeat against his chest. The kiss deepened, his mouth opened against hers, and she followed, learning the rhythm of him, matching it with her own. His thumb traced circles on her waist through the thin fabric of her nightgown. Her fingers curled in his hair. He wanted more. Every nerve in his body was telling him to pull her closer, to lay her down, to show her everything. But he felt the tremble in her hands, the newness of every touch, and it grounded him. He slowed, kissed the corner of her mouth, then her cheek, then the space just below her ear where her pulse fluttered fast against his lips. She made a sound, small, involuntary, somewhere between a sigh and a gasp. It nearly undid him. He pulled back, pressed his forehead to hers. "I should go," he murmured, "before I stop being a gentleman." "Is that hard?" "You have no idea." She smiled against his mouth. He kissed her one last time, quick, firm, a promise, and stood from the bed. At the window, he turned back. She was still sitting against the headboard, her hair slightly messed, her lips flushed, her eyes bright in the dark. "Tomorrow night?" he asked. "The window will be open." He climbed down the ivy with a grin he couldn't have hidden if he'd tried. 3 floors below, the garden was dark and still. But in the room above him, a light stayed on for a long time, and somewhere in the staff quarters, Mrs. Brennan lay awake. She had heard footsteps in the hallway that didn't belong there. She had noticed the girl lingering in the garden past her usual time. She had seen the way Sienna's eyes had changed over the past week. Brighter, more alive, more dangerous. Something was different, and Mrs. Brennan made it her business to find out what. Mrs. Brennan had worked in the Caldwell mansion for 11 years. She knew every creak of every floorboard, every draft that slipped through the old window frames, every shadow that moved across the halls after dark. She knew which maids cut corners and which ones actually polished the silver. She knew when the cook used store-bought stock instead of homemade, and she knew when something in that house was out of place. The girl was out of place, not physically. Sienna still followed her routine: breakfast at 8, reading in the library until noon, a walk in the garden before lunch. But the texture of it had changed. The girl moved differently, faster in some moments, slower in others, as if her body was operating on a rhythm that didn't match the house anymore. She hummed while she walked. She lingered at windows she used to pass without looking. And twice this week, Mrs. Brennan had caught her smiling at nothing. Sienna Caldwell did not smile at nothing. On Thursday morning, Mrs. Brennan positioned herself near the kitchen window that overlooked the east side of the garden. She poured a cup of tea she had no intention of drinking, and waited. At 8:32, Sienna walked out the back door. Same cotton dress, same bare feet. But this time her hair was down, loose and brushed, falling in waves past her shoulders. The girl never wore her hair down outside the house. She walked to the stone bench behind the hydrangeas, and she wasn't alone. The new gardener was already there, sitting on the grass with his sleeves rolled up. He stood when he saw her, and Mrs. Brennan watched the way his whole body turned toward the girl like a compass finding north. They spoke in low voices. Sienna laughed, a real laugh, the kind Mrs. Brennan hadn't heard in years. The gardener reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind Sienna's ear. Mrs. Brennan's fingers tightened on the teacup. She didn't move, didn't call out. She simply watched. And what she saw over the next 20 minutes confirmed everything she suspected. The way they sat close enough for their knees to touch. The way the girl leaned into him when he spoke, her face tilted up like a flower finding sun. The way he looked at her. Not the way servants look at the people they serve, but the way a man looks at a woman he would burn a house down for. When Sienna stood to leave, the gardener caught her wrist. Gently. She turned back. He pulled her toward him and kissed her. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't stolen. It was the kind of kiss that belonged to people who had been building toward it for days. His hand cupping her jaw, her fingers curled against his chest, their bodies swaying together like a single blade of grass in the wind. Mrs. Brennan set down the teacup and walked away from the window. She didn't go to Mr. Caldwell. Not yet. Information was currency in this house, and Mrs. Brennan had learned long ago that timing mattered more than truth. But the clock was ticking. Meanwhile, in the hidden corner of the garden, Sienna pulled away from the kiss, with her heart slamming against her ribs. "Someone's going to see," she breathed. "The hedges are taller than me." "That's not saying much. Everything's taller than me." He laughed. A real, full-bodied laugh that vibrated through his chest and into her palms, which were still pressed flat against his shirt. She felt the rumble of it in her fingertips, and something warm spread through her stomach. "I need to tell you something," he said. His expression shifted. The laughter dissolved into something more serious, the line of his jaw tightening. "The Farouk dinner your father is planning. I've been looking into it." Her smile dimmed. "How?" "I have resources." She pulled back slightly. "What kind of resources does a gardener have?" The question hung in the air between them. He held her gaze, and she saw something flicker behind his eyes. Not guilt, but the weight of a truth he hadn't yet released. "The kind that come from caring about someone enough to use them," he said. It wasn't an answer. She knew it. He knew she knew it. But the morning was too bright, and his hands were too warm on her waist, and she let it go the way you let go of a rope you know you'll have to pick up again later. "I'm going to find a way to stop that dinner," he said, "and I'm going to find a way to get you out of here. You keep saying that, because I keep meaning it." She looked at him, really looked, the way she'd started doing when she wanted to see past the surface of things. His eyes were dark brown, almost black in the shade of the hydrangeas. There were faint lines at the corners that deepened when he smiled, and there was something in the way he held himself, a steadiness that didn't match the dirt on his knees or the calluses on his palms. He stood like a man used to being listened to. "Who are you?" she asked softly, not accusing, wondering. "I'm the man who climbs your wall every night, because he can't stand the thought of you falling asleep alone in a house that treats you like furniture." "That's not what I asked." "It's the answer that matters." She studied him for another long moment. Then she rose on her toes and kissed his cheek. Her lips were soft and warm against the rough stubble of his jaw, and his eyes closed involuntarily, his breath catching in a way he couldn't disguise. "Whatever you're hiding," she whispered near his ear, "I hope you trust me with it before someone else finds out." She walked back to the house. He watched her go, his hands hanging at his sides, her words settling into his chest like a splinter he couldn't reach. She was right. He was running out of time. That night he climbed the ivy again. She was waiting by the window, the album of photographs open on her lap. She showed him pictures of her mother, a woman with the same green eyes and the same dimples, standing in a garden that looked like it belonged in a fairy tale. In one photo, she held a baby Sienna against her chest, both of them laughing. "She looks like you," he said. "Everyone says that." She traced the edge of the photograph with her finger. "But I think I got my stubbornness from my father. I just use it differently." He smiled. "You use it better." They talked until 1 in the morning. About her mother, about his father, who had built the bank from a single branch office and died when Matthew was 26. About the weight of inheriting someone else's dream and trying to make it your own. She fell asleep against his shoulder somewhere around 2. He stayed perfectly still, his arm going numb beneath her, his face buried in her hair. She smelled like lavender again. And something else, something warm and faintly sweet that he'd started to associate with safety, though he'd never needed the word before. He left before dawn, climbed down the ivy in the grey half-light, drove back to the city with the windows down and her scent still clinging to his collar. In his apartment, he sat at the kitchen counter and opened his laptop. He pulled up the file on the Farouk family, read every line again, then opened a new document and began writing a plan. He wasn't a gardener. He was a man with a bank, a legal team, and the kind of stubbornness that ran in his family too. It was time to use all of it. Friday came wrapped in fog, the kind that muffled sound and blurred edges, that made the garden feel like a place between worlds. Matthew arrived early, parked the borrowed truck by the service gate, and walked toward the rose beds with his shears and his plan and a knot in his stomach he couldn't untie. He had to tell her, not just the plan, everything, who he was, what he did, the bank, the penthouse, the investigator, the dossier. She deserved the full truth before he asked her to trust him with the rest of her life. He was rehearsing the words in his head when the back door opened. Sienna stepped out, but she didn't walk to the bench. She stopped on the patio, her eyes scanning the garden quickly, her body tense. Then she looked directly at him and shook her head once, a small, sharp motion. "Stay back." Behind her the door opened again. Mrs. Brennan. The woman walked out with the deliberate pace of someone who already knew what she was going to find. She wore a grey cardigan buttoned to her throat and an expression that could have curdled milk. Her eyes swept the garden, passed over the hedges and landed on Matthew with the precision of a searchlight. Sienna turned to face her. "I was just getting some air before—" "You were going to the bench." Mrs. Brennan's voice was flat, factual, like reading from a report. "The same bench you've been sitting at every morning this week, with him." The word fell like a gavel. Matthew set down the shears and stood. There was no point hiding behind the rose beds. He walked toward the patio with steady steps, his hands open at his sides. Mrs. Brennan watched him approach. Her eyes narrowed. "I've seen you, both of you, the talking, the touching." She turned to Sienna. "Do you have any idea what your father will do?" Sienna's face was pale, but her voice was steady. "Mrs. Brennan, please, he's just—" "Don't." The words snapped through the air. "Don't insult me with a lie. I've worked in this house long enough to know what I'm looking at." She turned back to Matthew, looked him up and down, the boots, the dirt, the jaw that didn't match the rest of the disguise. "You, off the property, now. And if I see you within 100 yards of this house again, I'll call the police before I call Mr. Caldwell." Matthew didn't move. His eyes went to Sienna. She was standing 3 feet from Mrs. Brennan, her hands clenched at her sides, her chin lifted just slightly. Not defiant, resolved. He took 1 step toward her. Mrs. Brennan shifted to block his path. "I said leave. I heard you." He looked past the woman, held Sienna's gaze. Green eyes wide and clear holding his with a steadiness that made his chest ache. "Midnight," he said. "Quiet. Just for her. Be ready." Mrs. Brennan grabbed his arm. Her grip was stronger than he expected. "Get out." He left, walked to the service gate without looking back, his hands steady, but his mind already racing through every detail of the plan he'd spent the last 2 nights building. The truck started on the first turn. He pulled onto the road and drove exactly 1 mile before pulling over to the shoulder and pressing his palms against his eyes. His phone was in his hand before his breathing leveled. "Claire, I need you to listen." "What happened?" "We were caught. The housekeeper saw us. She's going to tell the father." Silence on the other end. Then, "How long do we have?" "Hours, maybe less." "Okay." Claire's voice shifted. The playfulness was gone, replaced by something harder, quicker. "The jet. Is it available tonight? I'll call the pilot." "Vegas, that's the move." You said it yourself last week, quickest marriage license in the country. No waiting period, no blood test. I need to get her out first. Then get her out. I'll handle the rest. Mom, the chapel, the flight plan. Just tell me what time. Midnight. Midnight. She paused. Matt, are you sure? He stared through the windshield at the fog-covered road. 100 yards behind him, somewhere past the stone walls and the manicured hedges and the locked doors, a woman was standing in a garden she'd never been allowed to leave. I've never been more sure of anything. He hung up and called his pilot, then his attorney, then the car service. Each call was short, direct, surgical. This was what he did. He moved pieces, cleared paths, built structures out of chaos. The difference was that this time, the thing he was building wasn't a portfolio. It was an escape. Back at the mansion, the fog pressed against the windows like a living thing. Sienna stood in the center of her bedroom, her hands trembling, her mind working faster than it ever had. Mrs. Brennan had gone straight to her father's study. Sienna heard the door close, heard the low murmur of conversation that lasted 7 minutes. Then footsteps, heavy, fast, coming up the stairs. Her father appeared in the doorway. His face was the color of old brick. His mouth was a thin line, his nostrils flared, his eyes carrying a fury she had seen before but never directed at her with this intensity. Who is he? He's nobody. A gardener who... The slap came without warning. It was open-palmed, hard enough to turn her head and leave a mark that would last for days. The sound echoed off the walls of the hallway, sharp, final, like a branch snapping. Sienna pressed her hand to her cheek. The skin burned. Her eyes watered, but she did not cry. She looked at her father with a clarity she hadn't known she possessed. "You are not to leave this room," he said. "Not until I decide what to do with you." He slammed the door. The lock turned from outside. She stood in the silence. The room felt smaller than it ever had. The fog outside the window had thickened, pressing against the glass as if the world itself was closing in. She crossed the room and sat on the bed, opened the drawer of her nightstand, and took out 2 things. An album of photographs, worn, soft at the edges, filled with pictures of her mother in gardens and kitchens and moments of ordinary joy, and a bracelet, thin gold chain, with a single charm shaped like a crescent moon. Her mother had clasped it on her wrist the morning before she went to the hospital for the last time. Sienna held them both against her chest. Midnight. She didn't know what he was planning. She didn't know where they would go. But she knew the sound of his voice when he said the word, and she knew the look in his eyes when he made a promise. She pressed her back against the headboard and listened to the house grow quiet around her. For the first time in 25 years, she was not waiting to be told what to do. She was waiting to leave. The ladder hit the stone wall at 11:58. Matthew tested it twice, pressing his weight against the bottom rung until he was sure it wouldn't shift. The fog had lifted, and the moon hung low and bright, painting the ivy in silver. Behind him, the black sedan idled on the service road with its headlights off. His driver, Paul, sat behind the wheel with the engine barely humming, ready to move the moment they were both inside. Matthew climbed. The ivy scratched his arms through his jacket. His shoes scraped against the stone. Every sound felt magnified in the silence. The creak of the ladder, his own breathing, the faint rattle of a window somewhere on the first floor. When he reached the 3rd floor, the window was already open. She was standing just inside, barefoot on the hardwood, clutching a leather photo album against her chest with one arm. Her other hand gripped a small fabric bag. She was wearing the same dress from that morning, wrinkled now, her hair tied back in a loose knot. The mark on her cheek had darkened into a shadow that made his blood run cold. He reached through the window. "Give me your hand." She didn't hesitate. Her fingers wrapped around his, and he felt the tremble run through her entire arm. He guided her onto the sill. She swung one leg over, then the other, and he held her weight against his body as she found her footing on the ladder. "Don't look down," he murmured. "I wasn't planning on it." They descended together, rung by rung, his body bracketing hers from behind. When her bare feet touched the grass, she exhaled like she'd been holding her breath since he'd left that morning. He took the bag from her hand. It weighed almost nothing. "Is this all you're bringing?" "The album. My mother's bracelet." She touched her wrist. The gold chain caught the moonlight. That's everything that matters. He looked at her face, at the bruise blooming on her cheekbone. Something dark and dangerous moved through his chest. Not rage, but something close to it. Something that had teeth. He cupped her face with both hands. Gently. His thumbs rested on either side of the mark, framing it without touching it. "He will never touch you again," he said. His voice was low, controlled, but his hands were shaking. "Do you hear me?" "Never." She nodded. A tear slipped down her cheek and landed on his thumb. Warm. He kissed her forehead, then took her hand and led her across the lawn. Paul opened the rear door before they reached the car. Sienna climbed in. Matthew followed. The door closed. The car moved. She pressed her face against the window and watched the mansion shrink behind them. The stone walls, the dark windows, the iron gate passing in a blur. She watched it the way you watch a storm you've finally outrun, with relief and disbelief tangled together so tightly you can't tell which one is making you shake. Matthew reached across the seat and covered her hand with his. "Where are we going?" she asked. "The airport." She turned to him. "Why the airport?" "Because we're flying to Las Vegas." Her lips parted. "Las Vegas? I have a private jet waiting. My family is already on their way. There's a chapel booked for 3 in the morning." He paused. His thumb traced a slow circle on the back of her hand. "I want to marry you tonight, Sienna. Right now. Before your father can file a single paper or make a single call." The car hummed beneath them. The highway stretched ahead, empty and wide. "You want to marry me?" she repeated. Not a question, not disbelief. Something in between. The sound of a woman hearing words she'd read in books, but never expected to hear aimed at her. "I've wanted to marry you since the second morning on that bench, when you called me stupid and then let me stay." "I said brave or stupid." "You meant stupid." She laughed. It was small and broken and wet with tears, but it was a laugh, and the sound of it cracked something open in his chest that he knew would never close again. "I don't have a dress," she said. "Claire's handling it." "I don't have rings." "Taken care of." "I don't have—" Her voice caught. She pressed her free hand against her mouth. "I don't have anyone to walk me down the aisle." The car was quiet. Outside, streetlights passed in rhythmic pulses, casting amber stripes across the back seat. "You don't need anyone to give you away," he said. "You're not being given. You're choosing." She looked at him. The tears were falling freely now, streaking down her face and over the bruise and onto the collar of her dress. But her eyes were clear, bright, certain. "Yes," she said. "Yes? Yes, I'll marry you tonight in Las Vegas, in whatever chapel your sister found, in this dress with no shoes, holding a photo album." She wiped her face with the back of her hand. "Yes." He pulled her against him. She folded into his chest, her face pressed against his neck, her fingers gripping the lapel of his jacket. He held her with both arms, tight enough to feel her heartbeat against his ribs, and buried his face in her hair. She smelled like lavender and jasmine and the cold night air. "Thank you," she whispered against his skin. "For what? For making me brave enough to walk out a window?" He closed his eyes, his arms tightened around her. The car merged onto the highway toward the airport, and the Connecticut night blurred past the windows like something being left behind for good. 40 minutes later, they boarded the jet. It was small, 8 seats, cream leather, polished wood. Sienna ran her fingers along the armrest and looked around the cabin with wide eyes. She had never been on a plane before. Matthew buckled her seatbelt because her hands were shaking too hard to do it herself. "Scared of flying?" he asked. "Scared of everything." She looked at him, "But mostly scared that I'll wake up." He leaned across the armrest and kissed her. Soft, slow. His lips lingered on hers until she sighed against his mouth and her shoulders finally dropped. "You're awake," he whispered, "and I'm not going anywhere." The jet lifted off the runway at 12:52 in the morning. Below them, the lights of Connecticut grew smaller and smaller until they disappeared entirely. Ahead, the sky was open and black and full of stars. The chapel was smaller than Sienna had imagined. White wooden walls, a narrow aisle, rows of cushioned chairs instead of pews. A simple arch at the front, wrapped in white and pale pink flowers that someone had arranged with care. The air inside smelled like roses and candle wax, and soft music drifted from a speaker in the corner, something with a piano, gentle and unhurried. Claire was the first person she saw. Matthew's sister was standing near the arch in a silk blouse and jeans, mascara already smudged under both eyes, holding a bouquet of white peonies she'd clearly assembled herself because one side was significantly taller than the other. "Oh, thank God," Claire breathed. Then she crossed the room in 4 strides and wrapped Sienna in a hug that smelled like perfume and airplane coffee. "You're here. You're actually here." Sienna stood frozen for a moment. She couldn't remember the last time someone had hugged her like that, full-bodied, unguarded, without asking permission. Then she hugged back. Claire pulled away, held her at arm's length, and studied her face. Her gaze lingered on the bruise for exactly 1 second. Her jaw tightened. Then she said, "I brought you shoes and a dress. Well, it's more of a skirt and top situation, because I had 45 minutes to shop in an airport. But it's white and it's your size, and I swear on Gerald the goat that you'll look beautiful." Sienna blinked. "You know about the goat?" "He told you about Gerald?" "First week." Claire looked at her brother, who was standing by the chapel door with his hands in his pockets and an expression Sienna had never seen on his face before. Open, unguarded, almost boyish. "He's gone," Claire said softly, turning back to Sienna. "Completely gone. I've never seen him like this." She led Sienna to a small room at the back of the chapel. Inside, laid out on a chair, was a simple ivory skirt that fell to mid-calf and a delicate lace top with cap sleeves. Beside it, a pair of low heels with a thin strap. Sienna changed with Claire's help. The fabric was soft against her skin, and when she looked in the small mirror on the wall, she barely recognized the woman looking back. Not because of the clothes, because of her eyes. They were bright, alive. The kind of eyes that belonged to someone who just made the biggest decision of her life and didn't flinch. Claire pinned a single peony behind Sienna's left ear, stepped back, pressed her hand to her mouth. "Perfect," she whispered. In the main room, Matthew stood at the arch beside the officiant, a soft-spoken man with round glasses and a calm voice. Margaret Turner sat in the front row, her hands clasped in her lap, tears already falling. She had arrived an hour before them, driven straight from the airport, and had spent the time arranging flowers and telling the officiant 3 different stories about her son's childhood. Matthew tugged at his collar. He had changed into a white dress shirt that Claire had packed in the carry-on. No tie, no jacket. His sleeves were rolled to the elbows, and his hands, still marked with the faint calluses from 2 weeks of garden work, hung at his sides. Then the door at the back of the chapel opened. Sienna walked through it alone. No father, no escort, just her, small and steady, her chin lifted, the photo album and her mother's bracelet tucked against her side, the peony bright against her blonde hair. She held Claire's lopsided bouquet in her free hand and walked toward him with bare certainty in every step. Matthew's vision blurred. He blinked, swallowed, pressed his teeth together hard enough to feel the ache in his jaw. He had negotiated billion-dollar mergers without a tremor in his voice. He had faced boardrooms full of hostile investors without breaking eye contact. But watching this woman walk toward him in a chapel in Las Vegas at 3 in the morning undid every wall he'd ever built. His eyes were wet by the time she reached him. She stopped in front of the arch and looked up at him. Her lips trembled into a smile. "You're crying," she whispered. "No, I'm not." "Your face disagrees." He laughed. It came out thick and unsteady, and he wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, while Claire sobbed loudly from the front row, and Margaret handed her a tissue without looking away from her son. The officiant spoke. Simple words, traditional vows. Matthew's voice was rough when he said his, the words catching on something deep in his throat that he didn't try to smooth over. When it was Sienna's turn, her voice was quiet, but clear. Every word landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. The rings were plain gold bands. Claire had chosen them. They fit. "You may kiss the bride." Matthew cupped her face in both hands, the way he'd done in the garden, the way he'd done in the car. But this time there was no urgency, no fear. just the slow, deliberate press of his mouth against hers. She tasted like tears and peonies, and the beginning of something he didn't have a word for yet. Her hands came up to rest on his wrists, holding him there. And when the kiss ended, she kept her eyes closed for a long moment, as if she was memorizing the way it felt. Claire applauded. Margaret wept openly. The officiant smiled like a man who had seen 1,000 weddings and still believed in everyone. Outside the chapel, the Las Vegas sky was beginning to lighten at the edges. Pink and gold crept along the horizon, pushing back the dark. Sienna stood on the chapel steps with her husband's arm around her waist and watched the sunrise paint the desert in colors she'd only ever seen in books. "Mrs. Turner," Matthew said beside her, testing the sound, tasting it. She looked up at him. The bruise on her cheek had shifted to purple, but her smile outshone it completely. "Say it again." He leaned down and pressed his lips to her temple. "Mrs. Turner." She closed her eyes. The morning sun touched her face, and for the first time in her life, Sienna felt like she belonged somewhere. The hotel suite was on the 14th floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the Las Vegas skyline, a sprawl of light and movement that made the room feel like the inside of a jewel box, but Sienna wasn't looking at the view. She was standing in the middle of the room, barefoot again, the lace top still on, the bouquet set down somewhere she'd already forgotten. Her fingers turned the gold band on her left hand, around and around, feeling the weight of it. Matthew closed the door behind them. The click of the lock sounded louder than it should have. He didn't move toward her. He leaned against the door and watched her, the way she touched the ring, the way her shoulders rose and fell with each breath, the way the city light caught the fine hairs at her temples and turned them gold. "You're staring," she said without turning around. "I've been staring at you for 3 weeks. It's not going to stop because we signed a paper." She turned. Her eyes were soft, her lips slightly parted. The bruise on her cheek had faded into the low light, and what remained was just her, the dimples, the green eyes, the quiet steadiness that had made him climb a wall and rearrange his entire life. He crossed the room slowly, stopped in front of her, reached up and pulled the peony from behind her ear, setting it on the nightstand with a gentleness that made her breath catch. "We don't have to do anything tonight," he said. "We have the rest of our lives." She looked up at him. Her hand found his chest, fingers spread over his heart. She could feel it beating and fast, uneven, nothing like the composed man who ran a bank. "I want to," she whispered. "I've wanted to since you kissed me in the garden." He exhaled, a slow, shaking breath that traveled through his entire body. He kissed her, not like the garden, not like the car. This kiss was unhurried, deep, full of everything they'd built in whispered conversations and secret mornings and nights spent talking against her headboard. His hands moved to her waist, then up her back, his fingers tracing the line of her spine through the lace. She arched into him, her hands sliding up his chest to his shoulders, pulling him closer. He guided her backward until her legs touched the edge of the bed. She sat. He knelt in front of her, took her face in his hands and kissed her forehead, her eyelids, the tip of her nose, the bruise on her cheek. So softly she felt it more as warmth than pressure. "Tell me if anything feels wrong," he murmured against her skin. "Tell me and I'll stop." "Nothing feels wrong." Her voice was thin, trembling but sure. "Everything feels like it was supposed to start here." He undressed her slowly. Each button, each layer, treated with the kind of reverence she'd only ever read about. His lips followed his hands, along her collarbone, across the curve of her shoulder, down the inside of her wrist where her pulse beat wildly against his mouth. She shivered, not from cold, from the shock of being touched like she mattered. When she reached for his shirt, her fingers fumbled with the buttons. He covered her hands with his and helped. Their foreheads touched. She laughed, a nervous, breathy sound that made him smile against her lips. "Sorry," she whispered. "My hands won't cooperate. Take your time." She did, and when the last barrier between them fell away, he looked at her with an expression that made her forget every cruel thing anyone had ever said about her worth. He was careful, achingly, impossibly careful. He held her like she was the most important thing he'd ever been trusted with, and she felt it, in his hands, in his mouth, in the way he whispered her name against her neck, like a prayer he was learning for the first time. The pain was brief, swallowed by his patience and the steady rhythm of his voice telling her she was safe. She was beautiful. She was his. She cried. Not from pain. From the overwhelming realization that this was what it felt like to be chosen. To be held by someone who had torn his life apart just to be near her. He kissed every tear. Afterward, they lay tangled in white sheets that smelled like hotel lavender and each other. Her head rested on his chest. His arm wrapped around her, his fingers drawing absent patterns on her shoulder. The city hummed below them, indifferent and alive. Matthew? What if my father comes after you? Or the Farouks? What if they try to... He tilted her chin up until she was looking at him. His eyes were calm, not hard. Calm in the way that deep water is calm, still on the surface, immense underneath. I run one of the largest banks in the country, he said. I have legal teams, security teams, and enough resources to fight anyone who comes near you or this marriage. His thumb brushed her jaw. Your father is powerful in his world, but his world is very small compared to mine. She studied his face. You really aren't just a gardener. I was a terrible gardener. She smiled, pressed her lips to the center of his chest. I'm scared, she admitted. I know. He pulled her tighter against him. But you married a man who doesn't lose. She closed her eyes. His heartbeat was steady beneath her ear, constant, dependable, like a clock she could finally trust. Outside, the Las Vegas sun was fully up now, flooding the room with gold. A new day, a new name, a new life unfolding in a city built on the idea that anything was possible if you were bold enough to bet on it. Sienna Turner had placed her bet, and she'd never been more certain of anything. She woke to the feeling of lips on the back of her neck, slow, warm, deliberate. Each kiss placed like punctuation in a sentence he was writing on her skin. Sienna smiled before she opened her eyes. The sheets were soft against her body, and behind her, the solid warmth of Matthew pressed along her back, his arm heavy around her waist, his breath steady and close. Good morning, Mrs. Turner, he murmured against her shoulder. What time is it? Doesn't matter. She turned in his arms. His face was right there, unshaven, hair messy, eyes still soft with sleep. He looked younger like this, less like the man who commanded boardrooms, and more like the man who climbed ivy in the dark because he couldn't bear to leave her alone. She touched his jaw. The stubble was rough under her fingertips. He closed his eyes at the contact, leaning into her hand with a surrender that still surprised her. This man who controlled empires undone by the press of her palm against his face. Say my name, she whispered. Sienna. The new one. He opened his eyes, smiled. Sienna Turner. She kissed him. Not shyly this time, not tentatively. She kissed him like a woman who had discovered something extraordinary and intended to keep it. His hand tightened on her waist, pulling her closer, and she felt the rumble of a groan deep in his chest when her fingers slid into his hair. They moved slowly, unhurried, morning light spilling across the sheets, her body curved against his name whispered from her lips like it was the only word she remembered. It was different from the night before, softer, more familiar, as if their bodies had already started learning the language of each other and were practicing the words again with care. Afterward, he ordered room service. She sat cross-legged on the bed wearing his dress shirt, eating scrambled eggs and laughing at the way he struggled to open a jar of jam. You built a banking empire, she said, and you can't open a jar. Different skill set, clearly. He finally twisted it open with a grunt and handed it to her with exaggerated ceremony. She spread jam on toast and took a bite, and he watched her chew with an expression so openly adoring that she threw a grape at his head. He caught it, ate it, grinned. Then his phone rang. The shift was instant. His jaw tightened, his shoulders squared. He looked at the screen, and whatever softness had been in his face drained away like water through sand. It's my assistant, he said. Give me a minute. He stepped onto the balcony and answered. Sienna watched through the glass door. She couldn't hear the words, but she could read his body. The way he paced, the way his free hand gripped the railing, the way he pressed the phone harder against his ear as the conversation went on. When he came back inside, his face was composed. Too composed. The mask she'd seen him wear in the bank corridor. Polished, impenetrable, deliberate. "Your father knows you're gone," he said. "He's been calling everyone. The police, his attorneys, his contacts. He's telling people you were taken against your will." She set down the toast. Her appetite vanished. "He's looking for a gardener named James," Matthew continued. "He doesn't know who I am, not yet." "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to tell him." He picked up his phone and dialed a number his assistant had forwarded. Sienna sat on the bed, her hands wrapped around her knees, watching. It rang twice. "Who is this?" Richard Caldwell's voice came through sharp enough that Sienna heard it from across the room. "This is Matthew Turner, president of Turner National Bank." A pause so brief it was almost elegant. "I married your daughter last night." Silence on the other end, the kind that precedes an explosion. "You... what?" "Sienna is my wife. Legally married. By her own choice, of her own will, as a consenting adult." Richard's voice came back low and venomous. "I don't know what game you think you're playing, but I will destroy you. I'll have this annulled before the week is out. I'll bury you in lawsuits until I know about the arrangement with Amir Farouk." Matthew's voice didn't rise. It dropped. Quieter, slower. Each word placed with the precision of a surgeon. "I know you plan to sell your daughter into a marriage with his son in exchange for a business partnership. I know you kept her confined for 25 years to make her compliant. And I know that if any of this were to become public, it wouldn't be my reputation at risk." The silence that followed was different, heavier. "She is my daughter. She is my wife. And she chose to leave. That's all any court will care about." Matthew ended the call, set the phone face down on the table, turned to Sienna. She was crying, quiet tears that rolled down her cheeks without sound. Not from fear. From the shock of hearing someone stand between her and the man who had controlled her entire life. He sat beside her on the bed. Didn't speak, just pulled her into him, her face against his neck, his hand cradling the back of her head. "I've never heard anyone talk to him like that," she said against his skin. "Get used to it." She held on to him. The city buzzed below the window. Somewhere in Connecticut, her father sat in his study gripping a dead phone line, and for the first time in his life, the walls he'd built around his daughter couldn't reach her. They packed in silence. Not a heavy silence, a peaceful one. The kind that settles between two people who have said everything that matters and are saving the rest for the road. At noon, they boarded the jet for home. The apartment took her breath away, not because of the size, though it stretched wider than the entire second floor of the mansion. Not because of the furniture, though every piece looked like it had been chosen by someone with taste and money and time. What stopped Sienna in the doorway was the light. Windows lined every wall, floor to ceiling, and the city poured in from every direction, rooftops, bridges, the river catching the afternoon sun like a ribbon of silver. She stepped inside, slowly, touched the marble countertop in the kitchen, ran her fingers along the back of a velvet sofa, opened a window in the living room, and leaned out just far enough to feel the wind on her face. "You can change anything," Matthew said behind her. "The furniture, the colors, everything. This is yours now." She turned. He was standing by the front door with his hands in his pockets, watching her explore his home the way he'd watched her explore her first croissant, with his whole chest open. "Ours?" she corrected. Something shifted in his face, a softening he couldn't have hidden if he'd tried. The first week was a strange, beautiful dream. Sienna walked through the apartment, discovering rooms she hadn't seen. A study lined with bookshelves, a guest room with a view of the park, a closet larger than her bedroom at the mansion. She opened every cabinet, tested every faucet, stood on the balcony at night and stared at the skyline until her eyes ached from trying to hold it all. Claire came by on the third day with bags of clothes and a list of restaurants she insisted Sienna needed to try. Margaret arrived the next morning with homemade soup and a photo album of Matthew as a baby, which she narrated in detail while her son begged her to stop. "He refused to wear shoes until he was 4, Margaret said, turning a page. "We'd put them on. He'd take them off. Every single time. Mom. The neighbors thought we were raising a feral child." Sienna laughed so hard she spilled soup on Matthew's shirt. He looked at the stain, then at his mother, then at his wife, and sighed the sigh of a man who knew he was outnumbered. But the dream cracked on day 5. Matthew came home with a folder. Legal papers. Richard Caldwell had filed a kidnapping charge against an unidentified male who had allegedly abducted his daughter from her home. Sienna read the papers at the kitchen counter. Her hands were steady, but her jaw was tight. "He's calling it kidnapping," she said. "His lawyer is. The charge won't hold. You're an adult who left voluntarily. But the accusation is public, and that's what he's counting on." She set the papers down. "He's trying to control the story." "Yes. Then we tell the real one." Matthew looked at her. She stood with her back straight, her chin lifted, the gold bracelet catching the kitchen light. There was no trembling, no hesitation. This was the quiet courage he'd recognized in the garden, the kind that doesn't announce itself, but doesn't bend. "Are you sure?" he asked. "Once it's out there, it doesn't come back." "I've been invisible for 25 years. I think it's time people see me." He called his publicist that evening. By the next morning, an interview was arranged with one of the country's most respected journalists, a woman named Catherine Hale, known for her integrity and her reach. They sat together on the sofa in the apartment. Catherine's crew set up 2 cameras. Sienna wore a simple white blouse and her mother's bracelet. Matthew sat beside her, close enough that their knees touched. Sienna spoke. She described the mansion, the locked doors, the lessons taught by tutors who came and left without ever knowing her name, the father who chose her clothes and her meals and her future, the contract with the Farouk family, the son she was meant to marry, a man she'd never met and never wanted to. Her voice cracked once when she described the slap. Matthew's hand found hers under the camera's view, and she held it so tightly her knuckles went white. Catherine asked how she escaped. Sienna looked at Matthew. He looked at her. "He came for me," Sienna said. "He climbed a wall in the middle of the night and helped me out a window." The interview aired 48 hours later. Within a day, it had been watched by millions. The response was overwhelming. Support, outrage, calls for investigation into Richard Caldwell's conduct. Legal experts appeared on panels questioning the validity of the contract with the Farouks. And then the final blow landed quietly. The Farouk family withdrew. No public statement. No legal battle. They simply vanished from the arrangement like smoke clearing from a room. The condition the patriarch had demanded, that the bride be untouched, no longer applied, and with it, the entire deal collapsed. Richard Caldwell dropped the kidnapping charge 4 days later. His lawyers cited insufficient grounds, but everyone knew the truth. The man who had built his world on control had finally lost the one thing he couldn't buy back: his daughter's silence. 6 weeks after the interview, Sienna stood in the bathroom of their apartment holding a small white stick with both hands. The result was already visible, 2 lines, sharp and unmistakable, but she kept staring at it, as if looking away might change what she was seeing. Her hands shook, not from fear, from something so large it didn't fit inside her body, a fullness that pressed against her ribs and climbed into her throat and sat behind her eyes like a wave waiting to break. She set the test on the counter, walked to the bedroom, sat on the edge of the bed, stood up, sat down again. She picked up her phone and typed a message to Claire, deleted it, typed another, deleted that one too. Then she heard the front door open. Matthew's footsteps were always the same, steady, purposeful, the sound of a man who knew where he was going. She heard him set his briefcase on the hallway table, heard the soft thud of his shoes being kicked off, heard him call her name from the kitchen. "In here," she said. Her voice came out higher than she intended. He appeared in the doorway, tie loosened, sleeves already half-rolled, the way he always looked at the end of a workday, halfway between the man who ran the bank and the man who belonged to her. "What's wrong?" he asked immediately. "Nothing's wrong. You're sitting on the bed at 5 in the afternoon holding your own hands." She looked down. He was right. Her fingers were laced together in her lap, gripping so tight the knuckles had gone pale. She took a breath, stood up, walked to the bathroom, and came back with the test. She held it out to him. He looked at it, then at her. then at it again. The change happened in his face like weather. Confusion first. Then understanding. Then something that crumbled every wall he'd ever built around himself. A raw, unguarded flood of emotion that turned the president of Turner National Bank into a man who couldn't speak. His knees hit the floor, not slowly, not gracefully. He dropped, like the weight of what she'd just told him was too much to hold standing up. His hands found her waist, then her hips, and he pressed his face against her stomach. Flat, unchanged, holding a secret that was only hours old. He cried. Sienna had seen him angry. She'd seen him focused, tender, fierce. She'd seen his eyes water at their wedding. But she had never heard him cry like this. Deep, shaking sobs that vibrated against her body and made her own tears fall before she could stop them. She ran her fingers through his hair, held his head against her, let him feel what she'd been feeling alone in that bathroom, the impossible, terrifying, magnificent weight of a life they'd made together. "We're going to be parents," she whispered. He looked up. His face was wet, his eyes red, his expression so open it almost hurt to look at. "Say it again." She cradled his face in her hands. "We're going to be parents, Matthew." He turned his head and kissed her palm, then stood and pulled her into him, wrapping both arms around her, his chin resting on the top of her head, his chest still shaking with the aftershocks of something too big to name. Months later, on a Saturday morning in October, the rooftop garden was in full bloom. Matthew had commissioned it the week after their wedding, a private terrace on top of their building, designed to hold the same species that had grown around the stone bench in her father's garden. Hydrangeas, jasmine, wild mint, climbing roses that tangled along a wooden trellis he'd helped install himself. In the center, a stone bench, the same grey stone, the same simple shape. Sienna sat on it now with her son in her lap. 5 months old, dark hair, strong jaw, his father's eyes staring up at her with the kind of focus that already looked like it meant business. She bounced him gently on her knee, and he grabbed her finger and grinned, a wide, gummy, whole-body grin that made her laugh out loud. Matthew appeared through the terrace door carrying 2 mugs of coffee. He set them on the ledge and scooped the baby from her arms in one motion, lifting him high above his head. The boy shrieked with delight, arms waving, legs kicking, a sound so pure it seemed to clean the air. Sienna clapped her hands and laughed, and the gold bracelet, her mother's crescent moon, caught the morning light. On the bench beside her, the photo album lay open. Old pages at the front, her mother in gardens, holding a baby with green eyes and dimples. New pages at the back, a chapel in Las Vegas, a woman in lace, a man with tears on his face, a hospital room, a tiny hand wrapped around a finger, a family. Matthew lowered the baby to his chest and kissed the top of his head. Then he looked at Sienna. She looked at him, and the garden around them, planted from memory, grown from love, blooming in stubborn defiance of everything that had tried to keep them apart, swayed gently in the autumn breeze. No words. None needed. Just the 3 of them together, in a garden built on the 32nd floor of a building that touched the sky. Leave your comment and share this story with someone special. It truly helps us keep bringing new stories to you. And if you want to follow every chapter of this emotional journey, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell. Your support makes all the difference.